Hello, everybody.
Good morning. He does speak.
Yeah, I do. What you're standing in, we've had 110 cow-calf pairs. First of May until what?
May 7th.
May 7th. And then we'll be coming in here probably in 3 or 4 days with 113 pair. And Becky will tell you we got it marked how we've had it grazed in the last week here or so.
So Mike, the recovery time would be 80 to 90
80
days.
80 to 90 days on this one.
I just wanted to add that if you're curious about when they were in these other pastures, then we marked that with the dates and how long they are. So the papers are kind of flying in the wind, but that is marked. So if you wanted to know what those were. The last one obviously was that one right there. Looks really bad right in the front, but over the hill it's not quite as bad.
If I could ask, how big are these pastures and what's the maximum travel distance to water that the cattle do?
Traveling distance on water, probably a quarter mile, and the 50 to 60 acres each paddock. And there's 5 for this tank for watering. And then the watering system is shallow pipeline from the yard.
So how many days did you leave them in this paddock?
This one we grazed a little longer. That was 2 weeks with
And it's 65 acres?
65 acres. We had 60 pair in there.
So you don't move by days, you'd move by the use of the pasture?
That one we did by the use of the pasture. Usually we do by day, or we'll take.
Repeat the question, Mike, so
Oh.
everyone can hear the question.
Do we go by days or do we go by
Usage.
usage on it? This one we did on usage because there was a lot more cover yet on it. And then a lot of the other ones we'll do by days, where we'll visually look at it and keep 50% of the grass there yet and come back in probably, 60 days later or whatever. This fall we'll come back in.
So do you normally keep about 50% of the pasture grass when you move them?
This year we're trying to, and the years before. Last year we did it different because of the drought. We just visually done it that way last year.
Mike, I guess I'll for some comment. Because of the drought last year, did you move slower then? Obviously you took more grass.
Yeah, moved slower and took more grass. I suppose we left probably 40% last year, but we did it twice over last year on all the pastures.
And this year, of course, being somewhat the opposite, you probably moved quicker because it was greener.
Yeah,
So how many times will you graze this year?
maybe this one will actually hit 3 times. How many times will we graze this year? Twice on them, and the one we're standing in probably 3 times.
Did you notice a difference in this year's grass after coming off the drought last year and grazing heavier? Did it set you back some this year? Or?
None at all. Okay. Did it set us back on how we grazed last year? It didn't.
You had enough resiliency.
Yes, we have enough resiliency. Yep.
Let me come here. All right, first thing I'm going to do is bitch and complain a little bit. The videography is killing the spontaneity. And I'm going to ask Greg and Burke, to come here and let's be close. And rather than having to shuffle this collar to the stuff, we'll just pass it around. So a couple things I want to say. This question of do you go by the calendar or do you go by usage? I am totally a usage guy. Historically, we have seen a lot of failures in rotational grazing systems when people tried to run them on a calendar. And so I discourage calendar-based rotation. Every pasture, you look at it, assess what you have going in, have a target in your mind of what you want left behind, and then move from there. And you always need to be looking both ahead of you and behind you so you can see how it's recovering ahead of you, how it's recovering behind you. Then you make the adjustment on the place where you are. If you take every pasture and say, like, do the grazing plan, say, we're going to graze at the start of the season. We're going to graze this one 4 days, this one 5 days, this one 3 days, this one 7 days, based on what you think is going to happen. You're almost always going to be wrong. The landscape is different on, what did you say? You have, was it 1,600 or 2,300 acres here? How big's the farm?
2,300.
2,300. On a 2,300 acre farm, that's almost 4 square miles. The rainfall is going to be different from the north end of the place to the south end of the place. And in any given year, one part of the farm is going to be more productive than the other. So you got to constantly be flexible and fluid in changing the management. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to vote for usage-based grazing decisions, not the calendar.
Yeah, I think that's a big wreck waiting to happen when you start looking at the calendar and like today's Tuesday, we're going to move them on Thursday. And I'm constantly preaching that to my guys. We have people that work for us and, they get on this thing, well, we got to move the sheep on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'm like, no, you've got to look at your growth rate. You got to look at the rainfall. And so we track every single rain. We have rain gauges out. We know how much rainfall we get. We're constantly looking behind us. Are we getting any recovery? Folks, if your plants aren't recovering after you've grazed them, and you just keep grazing across your farm at the same rate, you're going to be dead. You're going to run out of forage, so you need to do something quick. One of the things that we do is we start selling off some call animals. We'll tighten our animals up. If we have 2 mobs, we'll put them together. We have 1. You don't know how many farms I've been on where people have 6, 7, 8, 10 herds, and they're getting around their farm too quickly. You're just killing your recovery period. One of your biggest tools in your grazer's toolbox is rest. How are you going to rest if you've got 7 herds going around your farm? And another thing, people say, well, I've still got forage here, Greg. Why are you moving your animals? That's because I want forage there when I come back. So leaving some behind, not taking it all, I think that's a big one for us farmers to get over. I was there. I used to think the same thing. I'm wasting it if I don't eat it. No, you gotta grow some carbon to have carbon. So we like to focus grazing more up in the top canopy, keeping the cows from taking it down to the dirt. You're always going to have more grass. And I'll pass it to Bert.
The one thing I'd say about
Got to hold them both.
The one thing I'd say about calendar is that I always like to make a calendar plan, recognizing, just as Jim said, it is not going to be what you're going to do because you have to do usage. The reason I like the calendar plan, however, is to give me a rough idea of where I should be and help me plan a recovery period, because I think recovery time is really, really important. And the drier it gets, the longer recovery needs to be. Okay, if you're going to have longer recovery and you've got a fixed number of paddocks, and that's why I like temporary fence, because then you don't have a fixed number of paddocks, but that means you have to stay longer. Well, if you pretty soon you're finding out you're having to, you have to stay longer to get your recovery, but you can't stay longer because the feed's disappearing. That's telling you, hey, you're not growing as much feed as you usually do. And it's really, when you're into rotational grazing, it's really a wonderful thing to have that early indicator that, hey, we're in kind of drought. And I've learned that the earlier you destock, the less you have to destock. And so I think that's one of the things that you can gauge really nicely when you plan when you plan your grazing and then you know where you are in relationship to that plan and you're trying to protect a recovery period. And I wish I could tell you what the ideal recovery period is here, but I haven't had enough experience here to tell you that. However, I do believe that in most grazing situations, wherever I've been and been able to spend a little time, most people's recoveries have been a little too short.
Well, I told you not to drop this.
Yeah, I know. Don't follow instructions
Yeah,
very well,
that
Jim.
was me. So dropping that made me forget what I was going to say. You just said you gotta have that recovery.
Your recovery time, and most people.
Oh yeah. How long should your recovery period be? The answer I usually give is how long does it take you to grow 4 leaves? 3 leaves on a plant is the minimum at which you're going to have a positive carbohydrate flow in the plant. If you have fewer than 3 leaves, the plant's going to be drawing on stored carbohydrates, and that's going, if you bite it off again, it's going to really slow recovery. So 3's the minimum new leaf growth that we want to have before we graze, and so I generally advocate, at least 4 leaves. So to me, that's the answer to how long the recovery period is how long does it take you to grow 4 leaves. Before we move on to another piece of the conversation, questions or comments on what we were just talking about there on recovery and such?
I have a question for you on that last comment.
Okay.
4 leaves. I've heard you say on several occasions that you've loved your situation in Idaho because you could predict the next rainfall.
You bet.
Where you can't predict the next rainfall, is 4 leaves enough?
Where you can't predict rainfall, is 4 leaves enough? In my view, yes it is, but we're not going to take it down to dirt. Where Burke has worked in a lot of dry places. And what do we consider dry? I'm going to say less than 10-inch annual precipitation.
Yeah.
Our annual precipitation is less than, natural precipitation is less than 8 inches where we live now. And you're going to grow 1 set of leaves a year. I mean, there's none of our land, our rangeland that gets grazed twice in a year. It's once a year grazing, and usually 20%, I'll say 20% of the pastures don't see any use during the growing season. On irrigated land, because we make it rain on a regular basis, we can run typically 3 to 4 grazing cycles in a year. But whether we're looking at the rangeland or the irrigated, that criteria of 4 leaves is kind of what we work from. So, questions, comments?
Gotta have enough leaf area for photosynthesis and CO2, and
You bet.
that's what I'm hearing.
You bet. Yeah. And something I'll add about that a lot of people don't understand is what goes on below ground and what goes on above ground is different whether you're in a wet environment or a dry environment in terms of where your biomass grows. When we were in Missouri, and there's a lot of work done with native prairie in Missouri, and less so with tame pastures. But in a high rainfall environment like that, or on irrigated pasture, about half of your biomass production is above ground, half is below ground. As you move to drier conditions, the percentage of biomass production above ground decreases, below ground increases. In the desert rangeland, only about 20% of your biomass production from photosynthesis is above ground. 80%, up to 80% of the plant growth, the carbohydrate flow, is all to developing the root system, because that's the key to survival in a dry environment. So proportionally, an inch of water gives you less forage yield in a drier environment than in a wetter environment. Part of it is because of that difference in how the plant partitions photosynthetic energy. Part of it is in a drier environment, you don't have as much cover, you lose more to evaporation. But an inch of water in a productive environment, and I would consider this a productive environment, gives you more yield than what an inch of water does in a dry environment. You want anything you want to comment on, Greg?
Just to change a little bit of the topic, I was going to tell a little bit about animal performance. we have found, we did 2 to 3 day rotations for years. We went to once a day rotation. Now we're down to twice a day rotation. And we have found that when you start moving animals more frequently and increasing your stocking density, you actually get animals that are more non-selective about what they graze. So it becomes a competition sort of thing. And we're starting to see better manure distribution. Places on our farm that we normally wouldn't have gotten animals step into, we're getting animals in there now. They're eating some of that. They're trampling it on the ground. And so, when you have a pasture like this behind us, you've already got the water source here. I'd be looking at possibly trying to maybe put some polywire in here and subdivide that a little bit. You're going to get, when animals go into a paddock, what's the first thing they do?
Go to the end.
Go to the other.
Go to the end. What plants do they eat first? The juicy ones. Great answer. And so the longer you leave them in that paddock, they go back and they'll eat all the good stuff, and then you leave them in there the last 3 to 4 days, they're going back and taking another bite off those good plants. They're not eating the stuff that they don't eat the first day. And so what you're doing is you're actually grazing toward more of this and less of what the animals want. And so if you move the animals off of that before they have a chance to take that second bite, you're going to be growing better forage. And so we tell the people, our cows get the candy every day. We don't make them eat the wrapper. And that's a big thing for us, yes.
We ranch with our son, and we put the herds together this spring for the first time because we finally got water enough. Okay, we ranch with our son in the desert southwest of North Dakota, and we put our 2 herds together, and so we've doubled our carrying capacity, doubled our number. And this spring, for the first time, we turned them out, and when we went to check them, it's like somebody mowed the pasture, and it's like, what did we do wrong? They ate everything, and we're still dry, and it was just scary to us. It's like, have they been here too long? Well, no, they haven't been here too long, but everything was clipped even height, and it was just like, wow, you've heard about it for years, but it's never quite happened.
Yeah, when you get, there's a big misconception, folks, when you hear the term mob grazing, and I've got some slides tonight. I'm going to show you what people termed as mob grazing. That's not mob grazing. We don't want it to be nuked. We don't want it look like you took a lawnmower out there. And a lot of people get that feeling that, they should eat everything. Everything should be on the ground. No. Animals can select a perfect diet if we allow them that situation. And that's what we're about. We're trying to get cows fat on grass. We don't feed anything. It's just all grass. Grass-finished beef, that's our deal. And so if you limit animals, you're going to find it out. That fall, you go to preg test, you're going to have some cows that are open. We don't want to do that. But, you've got water. That's a big one. You've got the fence. And I'm looking around. I'm like, man, boy, you could really jumpstart this even one step further just by putting some polywire and moving your animals more frequently. And I'm going to pass this to Burke. He talked about this yesterday a little bit. Fence and water. What were you saying? $57 an acre for the cost of a ranch?
Well, I know of a ranch out of Baker, Montana, where they spent roughly $50 an acre in fence and water. That included quite a bit of portable fencing material. And the guy said to me, hey, at $50 an acre for the number of acres we have seemed like a horrendous amount of money. But over a course of, and they didn't ratchet things up very fast. They started slowly and moved into it, and over the course of about 16 years, they went from 30 acres per cow to 16 acres per cow. And I asked him if he were to do it over again, what would he do differently? He said, oh man, I'd make the changes a lot faster. Why? He said, well, because I just bought another ranch for $50 an acre. And he said, I didn't have to add a machine, I didn't have to add a saddle horse, I didn't have to add manpower, I didn't have to add anything. He says it just takes a little more time when we brand, when we wean, when we ship, because now we got more cattle to work with. And, and the caution he gave is one is don't build too much high tensile fence. Even though it's semi-permanent, it's fairly easy to move, and and be careful with your water. Make sure over-design water. For you guys that are maybe newbies at this, just starting, if you're going to design water, design lots of water, because you're going to run more cattle than you think, and you're going to combine herds. You're going to try to get as few herds as possible, and that becomes important. And there's a couple of keys to that. One is if you got a water line, if it goes very far, don't be afraid to put a few more tanks on the line. That's fairly inexpensive. And reduce distance that cattle have to walk. Second of all, long and narrow is neat with your high tensile fence. Because if you're long and narrow and you've got a huge paddock, you can subdivide that as many times or as many ways as you want to quickly with temporary fence. And a lot of people say it's going to take a lot of time. It doesn't take a lot of time. These same people that I'm referring to over in Baker, Montana, rainfall not so different than from right here, a little less, but not big time different. I asked the guy's son, I said, what do you do in a day? I said, certainly you got to ship, you got to preg check, you got to brand, and you guys don't have to, but you tag your calves. So, but other than that, what do you have to do? And he says, I said, besides moving the cows, what else do you have to do? And he says, that's about it. And he said, last week, Dad and I went down to the South Ranch and we built enough fence to last the rest of the month. This is temporary fence. And he said, we did it before noon. He said, we'll have to do that every now and again. And then we'll have to take a little time to pull those fences back up. But people think it's going to take more time. Yeah, through the infrastructure stage to get things right, it'll take a little more time and a lot more thought. But once you've got it, you simplify things so much that it's incredible in terms of the labor that you can save.
Any questions or comments on that?
I hate to interrupt right now, but we should move on to our next site up on the hill, Jim. So
Take a quick question.
take one question, and then we're going to walk up through this gate up here.
Maybe we're not done here.
Somehow I knew I'd get that from you.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, that's a shocker, Jim.
You're killing the vibe.
Yeah, okay, we'll go up there. We will go up there after I tell one quick story.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So I did a whole series of workshops in Australia in 2013. And in interior Queensland, they have a lot of really tight clay soils. And a common practice there is what they call blade plowing, where you take a big caterpillar and you've got this tool they call a blade plow, which has shanks that go down in the ground, and then 24 to 30 inches in the ground, there's a horizontal blade that these shanks are doing, and they pull it to the ground, and yeah, it opens it up, it shatters the ground, and water infiltrates and all of those things. And everybody there knows, oh, that pays. If you want to ranch in this country and grow grass, you got to do that. And anytime I see a caterpillar with a big chunk of iron on the back in a pasture, I say, really? And so one of the things we commonly do in our business is cost-benefit analysis. So I asked them, what does it cost to do this? And they told me what it costs per acre, per hectare to do it. I said, okay, how long does the benefit of doing this last? Which means how often do you have to do this? Well, we got to do this every 10 years. What is the yield benefit that you get from it? What is the value of the livestock product? Put that all into the cost-benefit analyzer. And we did this several different locations, and every time it was a money loser. But everybody knows that pays. Okay, the standard size property there is 100,000 acres. That's when they homesteaded Central Australia, that's what a homestead was, 100,000 acres. And we talked about fence and water development, and everybody knows that it will never pay to put subdivision fence on that kind of landscape. It will never pay to run pipelines and tanks all over out there. Everybody knows that. There's a few guys who've done it. What did it cost per hectare to put the fence in? What did it cost to put the water in? What was the benefit you got? What was the value of the improved livestock performance? Typically, we ran the numbers, 20% annual return on investment. And everybody knows that it'll never pay. And everybody knows that the big chunk of iron, you have to do that and it pays to do that. And until you do that analysis, you do not know. And I very often talk about that investment in infrastructure exactly the way that Burke did. The cheapest ranch you will ever buy is the one that you buy just by putting fence and water on your place. All right.
Yep.